General Hospital spoilers for tease that Willow's yearning to reunite with Wiley and Amelia had grown into a quiet desperation that echoed through every corner of her life, shadowing her days and haunting her dreams. There was no substitute for the small hands she used to hold, the bedtime stories she once read, or the gentle rhythm of family routines that had once been her solace. Each sunrise without them deepened the ache in her chest, making her feel as though her world was continuing without her, spinning beyond her reach. Though Drew tried to comfort her, his reassurances began to feel hollow, because comfort was not what Willow needed. What she craved was presence, purpose, and the simple, irreplaceable joy of being a mother again. So when Michael, once unwavering in his determination to cut her out of their children's lives, began to exhibit a softening resolve, Willow felt something shift. It began subtly, with Michael's expression darkening after Wiley asked about his mother, followed by a strained silence and averted gaze. But soon came the real turning point. Michael offered the possibility of a visitation agreement. It wasn't a promise, but it was an opening, a fragile, flickering light in the dark corridor she'd been walking alone. For Willow, it represented hope. For Drew, it represented a threat. Drew had long positioned himself as Willow's protector, the architect of her redemption and the one who would shield her from the emotional storms of her past. But in truth, Drew's investment in Willow had become possessive, almost suffocating. He had worked tirelessly to paint Michael as the unstable one, the danger, the manipulator. He fed Willow warnings about trusting her ex, about how easily Michael could use the children to control her. And while Willow once found solace in Drew's guidance, she now began to feel a disquieting sense of pressure, an unspoken rule that every choice she made had to align with his plans. The idea that Michael might be willing to open the door for reconciliation with the children did not sit well with Drew. It challenged the carefully maintained narrative he had built, that Michael was unfit, untrustworthy, and driven by vengeance. If Willow accepted Michael's terms, it would not only erode Drew's influence over her decisions, but it might unravel the foundation of their entire relationship. He feared losing not just Willow's loyalty but her emotional dependence. And in that fear, his behavior grew more erratic. Willow, meanwhile, was trapped in the middle of this growing storm. She wanted peace. She wanted healing. And most of all, she wanted to be with her children. But the road to that future came with landmines. Drew's controlling nature on one side and Michael's complicated, conditional offer on the other. It wasn't just about visitation anymore. It was about who got to define her life, her role as a mother, and whether she had the strength to step out of someone else's shadow and reclaim her agency. Michael, for all his faults, had begun to see the toll that separation was taking on the children. Wiley was confused, his behavior changing. Amelia asked questions with wide eyes and didn't understand why her mother's voice was only heard through brief phone calls and never at breakfast. Michael realized that perhaps in his quest for retribution, he had punished not only Willow but also their children. That revelation sparked his decision to make an offer, to allow supervised visits, to entertain the possibility of co-parenting again, albeit on his terms. But Michael's offer came with caveats. He didn't want Drew present. He didn't trust Drew's intentions. In fact, he suspected that Drew had contributed to Willow's instability and emotional fragility. So Michael made it clear, if Willow wanted to be a part of Wiley and Amelia's lives, she would need to meet him alone, without Drew's interference. This was a line in the sand, and Willow now stood at the edge of a difficult decision. Drew, sensing his grip loosening, tried to reassert control. He warned her again, Michael couldn't be trusted, the court battle wasn't over, and any misstep could cost her everything. He spoke in veiled threats cloaked as concern. And Willow began to wonder whether the man she had relied on had become her jailer instead of her liberator. His words, once a source of comfort, now felt like chains. As the days passed, the tension became unbearable. Willow agreed to meet Michael in a neutral setting, just to talk. She told herself it was for the children, but deep down, she knew it was also for herself, for the clarity, for the truth. Michael looked tired, emotionally worn. He didn't yell or accuse. Instead, he asked if they could try, for the children's sake, to find common ground. He reminded her that Wiley still loved her, that Amelia still needed her, and that whatever happened between them, the children deserved both parents in their lives. Willow felt tears rise to her eyes. She had waited so long to hear those words. But the path forward wouldn't be easy. Even if she reached a deal with Michael, Drew would likely try to sabotage it. His need to be in control, to be the center of Willow's world, had become more pronounced. And Willow now had to reckon with a painful truth. The greatest threat to her reclaiming her life as a mother might not be Michael, but the man who claimed to love her. The pressure was building. A mother's love. A father's pride. A partner's possessiveness. And two innocent children caught in the middle of a quiet war. Willow stood at the threshold of a choice that would define the rest of her life. Would she bow to Drew's influence or fight for her right to be with her children, on her own terms? Either way, the days of quiet compliance were over. A reckoning was coming. Willow's world was beginning to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated, and as much as she tried to maintain composure, the weight of her fractured family and the growing tension with Drew was becoming too much to carry. She had spent months trying to convince herself that choosing stability over uncertainty was the right path forward, that her engagement to Drew was a reward for all the pain she had endured. He had stood beside her when everything seemed lost, through her illness, through her estrangement from Michael, through the collapse of the life she once knew. But now, with each passing day, that sense of gratitude was slowly being replaced by an undeniable sense of entrapment. The man who once protected her had become the gatekeeper to her children. The voice that questioned her every instinct, the wall between her and the very things that made her feel alive. It was Michael's unexpected offer, an olive branch. An opening for Willow to reunite with Wiley and Amelia on new terms, that shattered the illusion entirely. It was supposed to be impossible. That the same man who once swore to cut her out of their lives would now offer a compromise, an invitation back into her children's world. And yet, there it was, laid out clearly in conversation. With none of the venom Drew had prepared her to expect. Michael wasn't the man Drew had made him out to be, not anymore. And that revelation left Willow reeling, forcing her to examine everything she had built her new life around. If Michael was no longer the enemy, then what exactly was Drew? She approached Drew with the offer, hopeful that he would at least be open to discussing the possibility. But she never made it past the first few sentences. The mere mention of Michael's name ignited something in Drew, a defensiveness so sharp it felt like an accusation. He interrupted her, dismissing Michael's intentions, warning her of manipulation, gaslighting her into believing that even considering the deal meant betraying their commitment. The conversation quickly spiraled, no longer about visitation rights but about power, fear, and control. Drew's voice was calm at first, calculated, the way it always was when he wanted to appear reasonable while asserting dominance. But Willow knew that tone now. It was the same tone he used when he wanted to steer her toward a conclusion without her realizing it. Only this time, she did realize it. And she resisted. She pushed back, calmly at first, but with growing force, demanding the respect to make her own decisions about her own children. The moment she pushed, Drew's mask cracked. His tone sharpened. He accused her of being naive, of letting sentiment cloud her judgment, of forgetting who stood by her when everyone else turned away. But all Willow heard was panic that he was losing control of the narrative. She reminded him that Wiley and Amelia were not pawns in a custody war. They were her children too. And she would not allow her relationship with them to be dictated by Drew's personal hatred of Michael. The more she spoke, the more she rediscovered her strength. She realized that for too long, she had let her decisions be shaped by guilt, by obligation, by a desire to repay kindness with loyalty. But love built on obligation was not love at all. And partnership that required silence was not a partnership worth keeping. By the end of their argument, Drew's desperation had given way to silence. He left the room, seething. Not because she had betrayed him, but because she had refused to be controlled. And Willow, left alone in the echo of his departure, finally understood what had been brewing beneath the surface of their relationship all along. It wasn't partnership, it was possession. It wasn't support, it was strategic dependence. And she was done living in that kind of arrangement. Willow knew, in her bones, that the wedding could not happen. Not now. Not under these terms. Every bridal fitting, every cake tasting, every carefully arranged seating plan had become meaningless in the face of this truth. The wedding had been a symbol of survival, of emerging from grief with something new to cling to. But now, it felt like a cage. She couldn't say yes to a man who didn't trust her enough to be a mother, who saw her as an extension of his narrative rather than a person with her own. Michael, whether she ended up with him or not, had given her a gift, clarity. His offer, simple and sincere, had shown her what real love could look like, selfless, child-focused, healing. And though Willow wasn't ready to forgive him entirely, she was ready to reclaim her voice and her place in her children's lives. The collapse of the wedding wouldn't be loud. There would be no dramatic announcement, no runaway bride spectacle. Just quiet decisions. A conversation withdrew that ended with a returned ring. A cancelled venue. A discarded dress. But the emotional fallout would be thunderous, echoing through every corner of Port Charles. Drew would feel it as a betrayal. Michael would see it as hope. And Willow, for the first time in a long time, would feel it as liberation. What comes next will not be easy. Drew will not give up control without a fight. He may retaliate in court. Seek to poison Wiley and Amelia's perception of their mother, or worse, weaponize the very love she has for her children. But Willow is no longer the woman who stood silently in the face of injustice. She has reclaimed her strength. And with that strength, she will fight for her children, not just to be near them, but to be whole again, for them and for herself. Wiley and Amelia had always shared an unspoken bond with Willow, a connection born not just of biology, but of the quiet, nurturing moments that had once defined their everyday life. Now, separated by court orders, bitterness, and the rising tensions of adult conflicts, that bond had been stretched thin, but not broken. Each time Wiley glanced at a picture of his mother, or Amelia whimpered for her during sleepless nights, the ache in their hearts deepened. For children, love is not complicated, it's instinctual, simple, and pure. And in their young minds, the absence of Willow wasn't something they could rationalize, it was something they felt, raw and relentless. What had begun as a bitter custody battle between adults was transforming into something far more emotionally charged. Wiley, who had grown increasingly quiet and withdrawn, began expressing more and more clearly that he missed his mother, her hugs, her lullabies, her presence. Amelia, too young to articulate her confusion, began acting out in small, heartbreaking ways, as if protesting a world that made no sense. And Michael, witnessing his children's unraveling, could no longer ignore that the legal lines he'd drawn in the sand were now erasing parts of his children's emotional stability. It was this growing emotional unrest in Wiley and Amelia that catalyzed something powerful and irreversible. The children didn't understand legal strategy or revenge. All they knew was that their mother was gone, and they wanted her back. Their yearning created a new kind of pressure, one that no courtroom could contain and no lawyer could dismiss. Michael, though still cautious, began to soften. For all the damage that had passed between him and Willow, he could not deny that their children's happiness had to come first. But as this emotional groundswell grew, it placed Willow at the center of a storm she could barely control. The knowledge that her children needed her, truly needed her, began to unearth a fierce maternal instinct that had been suppressed for too long. She was no longer willing to wait patiently for permission or appease those who sought to control her through guilt or manipulation. The image of Wiley reaching out his arms, or Amelia calling her name in the night, became the fuel for a new kind of fire within her. She was done playing by Drew's rules. Done letting his insecurities dictate her access to her children. This shift didn't come without consequences. Drew, seeing Willow's resolve solidify, began unraveling. He knew that once Willow made contact with Michael and the children again, his control over her would weaken. And more than anything, Drew feared losing not only his fiancée, but the illusion that he was her protector. So he began pushing harder, framing her as unstable, ungrateful, too emotional to make sound choices. But each attempt only confirmed Willow's growing suspicion: this wasn't love anymore. It was control masquerading as protection. Meanwhile, the situation continued to escalate. Wiley and Amelia's behavior grew more unpredictable. Wiley had a breakdown in school, crying uncontrollably when a teacher mentioned Mother's Day. Amelia refused to sleep unless someone pretended to be Willow. These weren't isolated incidents, they were emotional sirens, warning that the damage of separation was becoming irreversible. And as Port Charles watched the Corinthos family quietly implode from within, all eyes turned to Willow. Would she fight back? Would she reclaim her place before it was too late? Willow wasn't just battling for visitation rights anymore. She was fighting for the future of her children's emotional well-being, for the sacred bond that no court document could erase. And in doing so, she was rediscovering herself. No longer the quiet, passive survivor, she had become a force of quiet determination, ready to upend the very foundation of the life she thought she wanted with Drew. The emotional stakes had never been higher. This wasn't about revenge or pride. This was about healing. About reunion. About a mother's love refusing to be silenced by courtroom walls or a possessive partner's grip. And as Willow stood at the precipice of change, the weight of her children's longing, Wiley's brave insistence, Amelia's tearful pleas, became the thunder in her chest that would not be ignored. The future was uncertain. The legal fights ahead would be grueling. But one thing was no longer in question: Willow was coming back for her children. And not even Drew, with all his strategic maneuvering and whispered warnings, could stop the storm that was coming. Because when a mother finally hears the call of her children, nothing, not fear, not control, not even a broken engagement, can stand in her way. Drew had once believed that control was the key to preserving the future he had built with Willow, control over the narrative, over her choices, over the path that led them toward marriage. But that control had begun to slip like sand through his fingers the moment Willow's maternal instincts reawakened. When Willow and Michael sat down to discuss a custody compromise, what began as a fragile negotiation soon evolved into something deeper, something Drew hadn't anticipated. A reconnection forged not only through their mutual concern for Wiley and Amelia but through the powerful, unspoken emotional history that still lingered between them. And as Drew watched from the outside, excluded from the quiet understanding and shared purpose building between them, a dangerous obsession began to take root. He knew he had to act before the bond between Michael and Willow rekindled fully and left him standing in the ruins of his failed manipulation, fueled by a toxic mix of panic and pride. Drew began drawing up a counteroffensive plan to invalidate whatever agreement Willow and Michael reached. His legal advisors, paid handsomely and loyal only to his ambitions, were already drafting filings to challenge visitation rights and position Drew as the more stable influence in the lives of Wiley and Amelia. He planned to portray Michael's softened stance as a temporary lapse in judgment and Willow's emotional overtures as evidence of instability. But underneath the legal strategies and veiled threats, Drew's true fear had nothing to do with the children, it had everything to do with losing Willow's heart. Because as much as he tried to deny it, Drew saw it clearly. Every time Willow spoke with Michael, her voice softened. Every time she looked at Wiley or held Amelia's drawings, something in her eyes changed, something that no longer belonged to Drew. And worse, Michael was beginning to see it too. Their shared pain over their children had transformed into late-night conversations, passing touches, and lingering memories of the love they once had. The emotional walls that once stood tall between them were beginning to crumble, brick by brick, and in their place rose the possibility of something neither had dared to admit out loud: that they might still love each other. Willow didn't make this choice lightly. She had worked hard to convince herself that her future with Drew was safe, predictable, even healing. But love was never meant to be a cage. And what she now shared with Michael, a deepening alliance for the sake of their children, began to feel more honest than anything she had with Drew. With Michael, there were no ultimatums, no veiled manipulations. There was just a quiet strength, a mutual respect, and an undeniable emotional tether that had never fully broken. No matter how far apart they drifted. Drew, sensing this tectonic shift, began spiraling. His obsession with control deepened into surveillance, confrontation, and whispered accusations. He cornered Willow with questions she refused to answer, watched her phone when she wasn't looking, and began threatening legal action if she continued her unauthorized meetings with Michael. But every attempt to tighten his grip only pushed her further away. And as Willow grew bolder in asserting her independence, for herself and for her children, Drew's carefully crafted image began to fracture in front of everyone. Especially the family court observers now closely watching the drama unfold. In private, Michael tried to keep his distance emotionally. He had told himself repeatedly that this was about the kids and nothing more. But in the quiet of the nursery, when Willow held Amelia and whispered lullabies that once echoed through their old home, Michael couldn't help but imagine a life restored. A family rebuilt not out of obligation, but out of love. And for the first time in months, hope returned, not just for Wiley and Amelia, but for Willow and Michael too. The battle ahead with Drew would not be easy. He had money, resources, and a ruthless determination to hold on to the life he believed he deserved. But what Drew lacked, what he could never fabricate, was the raw, irreplaceable connection between two parents who were beginning to remember what it felt like to fight together. Not against one another. What started as a legal skirmish over custody had evolved into a war of hearts, and Willow was no longer willing to let fear or pressure dictate her future. She was no longer the woman Drew thought he could mold. She was a mother reclaiming her identity, a woman rediscovering her voice, and perhaps most dangerously for Drew, someone who might be falling in love with Michael all over again. As whispers of a possible romantic reconciliation between Michael and Willow begin to echo through Port Charles, the pressure mounts. Drew's fury simmers beneath the surface, and the threat of retaliation looms. But for now, all eyes are on a mother and father united not just by their children, but by the quiet, enduring power of unfinished love. And in a town like this, where secrets are currency and revenge is always just one step away, nothing, especially not love, stays buried forever.